It all began with the little things, the subtle changes in Kelly's behavior that at first seemed insignificant but, with time, gnawed at the edges of my peace. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when I first noticed it, but looking back, the signs were everywhere. She had always been somewhat private with her phone. Everyone is to some extent these days, but recently it had become excessive. The phone was always in her hand, never more than an arm's reach away, even when she didn't seem to be using it. It wasn't just the frequency, it was the way she guarded it, the way she placed it screen side down on the table whenever we were in the same room, or the way she'd quickly swipe away notifications as if afraid I'd see something. Initially, I didn't think much of it. I told myself that I was being paranoid and that everyone deserves a little privacy, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with messages, emails, and social media. But there was something else beneath the surface. Something that felt wrong. It was as though an invisible wall had started to form between us, a distance I couldn't quite explain but could undeniably feel. Then there were her sudden absences. Small things, really, extra long trips to the grocery store, unexplained delays on her way home from work, or the sudden urgent need to step out and meet a friend I had never heard of before. At first, I chalked it up to stress, maybe something at work, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. It was the way her eyes avoided mine when I asked casual questions about her day, the way her answers felt rehearsed, just a little too perfect, too smooth, like she had anticipated my questions long before I asked them. But the real trigger for my suspicion was the way she behaved around our neighbor, Michael. We'd known Michael for years. He was our age, lived alone, and was friendly enough. We often invited him over for barbecues or casual drinks, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, over the past few months, I had started noticing the way Kelly's demeanor shifted whenever Michael was around. It wasn't anything overt at first, just small things, fleeting moments that, in isolation, seemed harmless. When Michael would come over, Kelly would suddenly become more lively, more animated, as if a light had been switched on inside her. She would laugh at his jokes, sometimes even ones that weren't particularly funny, with a brightness in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a while. It wasn't jealousy that ate at me then, but the simple observation that she seemed happier in his company than in mine. At first, I dismissed it, maybe I was just imagining things. But the more I saw, the harder it became to ignore. The way her eyes would linger on him for just a second too long, how she seemed more attentive, more attuned to his presence than to mine. The tipping point came one evening when Michael stopped by unannounced. We were in the middle of dinner, and Kelly immediately jumped up to greet him at the door. I watched from the dining room as she stood in the doorway, her body language noticeably different, relaxed, almost flirtatious. They stood there, talking for what felt like an eternity, and though I couldn't hear their conversation, the ease between them was palpable. When Kelly finally came back to the table, she was flushed, her face slightly flushed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She barely touched her food after that, pushing her plate around, lost in thought. It was that night, lying in bed beside her as she scrolled through her phone, that the doubt sank in. Something was going on, something she wasn't telling me. I could feel it in my gut, that primal, instinctual feeling that something was very wrong. When I rolled over to look at her, her phone screen quickly dimmed, and she turned away, pulling the covers up as though shielding herself from my gaze. She said nothing, and I didn't press her, but the silence between us spoke volumes. In the days that followed, I became more vigilant and more attuned to every little shift in her behavior. The phone was always present, always a barrier between us. She started disappearing into the bathroom for longer periods, always with her phone in hand. Whenever I walked into the room, she would quickly close whatever app she was on, offering a tight-lipped smile and a lame excuse about work emails or texts from her sister. But the excuses didn't add up, and my suspicions grew. Every interaction with Michael from then on was magnified in my mind. I started watching for the signs, how often they'd stand too close, how their conversations were peppered with inside jokes I wasn't privy to. It was the way their eyes met across the room, a look that passed between them like a secret, shared but unspoken. My stomach would knot whenever I saw it, that look that screamed more than friendship. Kelly was pulling away from me, and I couldn't figure out why. But deep down, I was beginning to realize that maybe the reason wasn't something she'd ever admit to. Maybe she didn't need to say it. It was a quiet evening, one of those nights when everything seemed normal on the surface, but beneath, I was boiling. Kelly and I had barely exchanged words all day. I had been watching her more closely, my suspicions growing stronger with every passing moment. Her behavior had become so predictable. She'd sit on the couch with her phone in hand, scrolling through God knows what, but I knew. I knew it wasn't just work emails or innocent messages to friends. There was something else going on, something I couldn't ignore any longer. That night, as she headed upstairs for her usual long shower, I made my decision. I had to know the truth. I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore, the gnawing feeling that I was being lied to, betrayed. So, when I heard the water running, I saw my chance. Her phone was lying on the coffee table, screen down as always, and for a moment, I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to do it, didn't want to confirm the worst of my fears. But another part of me, the part that had been suffering in silence, needed to see. I needed to know. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the phone. I could hear the sound of the water in the distance, the steam from the bathroom slowly creeping into the hallway, and I knew I didn't have much time. I unlocked her phone. I knew her passcode. We had always been open about those things, or at least I thought we had. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There were the usual apps. The messages, the emails. But then I opened her text messages and that's when I saw it, Michael's name, right at the top of her most recent conversations. My heart pounded in my chest, the kind of heavy thud that makes it feel like it might just explode. I didn't want to click on it, but I couldn't stop myself. And there it was. Everything I had feared, laid out in front of me, undeniable and brutal. The messages weren't just friendly exchanges. No, these were filled with details of their encounters. Descriptions of their stolen moments together when I wasn't around. There were mentions of times and places, confirmations of things I didn't want to believe had happened. They spoke in code sometimes, but the meaning was crystal clear. She wasn't just talking to him. She was with him. She was his in ways that she hadn't been mine for a long time. The anger started rising inside me, hot and fast, but what broke me was the photos. Hidden among the texts were pictures, explicit, intimate photos that she had sent him. Photos she had taken in our house, in our bedroom, in my bed. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me. I felt sick, my stomach churning as I scrolled through the evidence of her infidelity. Each image, each message, was like a knife being driven deeper into me. I could hear the water from the shower still running upstairs, and in that moment, I wanted nothing more than to storm up there, throw the phone at her, and demand answers. I wanted to shout, to rage, to ask her how she could do this to me. But as the fury coursed through my veins, a cold, calculating thought emerged. Confronting her now, in the heat of the moment, would accomplish nothing. It would give her the satisfaction of knowing she had broken me, and I wasn't going to let her see that. No, this required something else, something bigger. As I stood there, staring at the phone, I knew that I had to hurt her in the same way she had hurt me. But a confrontation wouldn't be enough. She needed to be destroyed in the one way that would hurt her the most, public humiliation. Kelly was obsessed with her image, with the perfect life she projected to the world. She prided herself on her reputation, on the respect she commanded among her friends and her colleagues. That's where her true vulnerability lay. Slowly, I put the phone back down on the table, careful to leave everything exactly as I had found it. I didn't want her to suspect anything. Not yet. My mind was already racing, formulating a plan. If I was going to get back at her, I needed to be smart and methodical. I needed to strike when she least expected it, to use her fears against her. I knew her well enough to know that being exposed, and having her dirty little secret revealed to everyone she knew, would be the one thing she couldn't handle. It would crush her. As I stood there, staring at the blank screen of her phone, I felt an eerie calm wash over me. The anger was still there, bubbling beneath the surface. But now it was cold, controlled. I wouldn't lash out. I wouldn't confront her in a moment of rage. Instead, I would play the long game. I would make her pay, slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the life she had so carefully constructed. I would expose her for who she was, not just to me, but to everyone. The moment I decided on my course of action, everything changed. Confronting Kelly directly would have been too easy, too simple. She needed to feel the same suffocating dread. The same fear that had been gnawing at me ever since I'd found out about her affair. But I didn't want to confront her in person. No, that wasn't enough. She had to be left wondering, spiraling, unsure of who knew and when her secret would finally be exposed. That's when the idea of anonymous messages came to me. I'd be the invisible hand guiding her toward her unraveling. If there's one thing I knew about Kelly, it was that her greatest fear was being found out, being judged by the people she cared about. The people who admired her. She was so obsessed with her image, so wrapped up in maintaining the facade of the perfect wife, the successful woman, that the mere thought of losing it all would paralyze her. I began by setting up a new email account, something untraceable and nondescript. It was simple, just a string of random numbers and letters. No name, no identifying details. I wanted to be a ghost, someone she could never pinpoint or confront directly. The plan was to slowly, methodically chip away at her confidence, feeding her fear until it consumed her. The first message was short, almost innocuous. I didn't want to scare her too much at first, it had to be subtle. The point was to make her doubt herself, to plant the seed of paranoia and let it grow. I typed out the words carefully, my fingers shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and anticipation. "I know what you're doing." That was it, just 5 words, but loaded with implications. I sent the email late at night after she had gone to bed. I could picture her finding it the next morning, reading those words over and over again, trying to decipher their meaning. Was it a joke? Was it a spam message? Or was it something more sinister? The ambiguity was the key. She wouldn't know if it was meant for her specifically, but the doubt would start to creep in. I could already imagine her checking her phone, her heart racing, wondering if someone had seen something. Someone like me. A few days passed, and I watched her closely. She didn't say anything to me, but I could see the subtle changes in her behavior. She seemed more distracted, her eyes darting to her phone more often, as if she was expecting something. Perfect. That's when I decided it was time for the next message. People are starting to talk. This time, I knew it would hit harder. Kelly had always been hyper-aware of what people thought of her. The idea that someone might be discussing her behind her back, that rumors might be spreading, would terrify her. I sent it in the middle of the afternoon when I knew she'd be at work, surrounded by her colleagues. I imagined her phone vibrating on her desk, her hands freezing as she saw the notification, her mind racing as she opened the email. Again, no details, no specifics, just a vague but threatening statement. I could almost feel her pulse quickening, her anxiety growing as she tried to figure out who could have sent it and what they knew. Was it someone at work? A neighbor? Or worse, could it be me? But I knew she wouldn't dare ask me directly. Not yet. Over the next few days, I continued to send messages, each one designed to tighten the noose around her, slowly but surely. I increased the intensity of the language, pushing her deeper into paranoia. "You can't hide forever. Soon, everyone will know. Your secret won't stay buried much longer." I watched as her behavior became more erratic. She was jumpy, constantly looking over her shoulder, always glancing at her phone, checking her email multiple times throughout the day. She became more distant and distracted, almost as if she was constantly waiting for the hammer to fall. And that's exactly what I wanted. There was a subtle thrill in knowing I had this kind of control over her without her even realizing it. The beauty of it was that I didn't need to do anything physical, didn't need to raise my voice or confront her face to face. Instead, I was burrowing into her mind, making her unravel from the inside out. The more I watched her, the more certain I became that the fear was taking hold. She was a prisoner of her guilt, and I was merely giving it a voice. One night, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I saw her glance at her phone and stiffen. I knew she had received another one of my messages. I had sent it just before we sat down. "Do you think they'll forgive you?" She quickly locked her screen and set the phone down on the coffee table, her face pale. I didn't say anything. I just watched her out of the corner of my eye, waiting for her to crack. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, barely paying attention to the show. I could see the thoughts running through her mind, the wheels turning. I wondered what she was imagining. Maybe a coworker or a neighbor discovering the truth and gossiping behind her back. Maybe she was picturing a full-blown scandal, her name being whispered in disapproving tones at parties and family gatherings. The tension in the house grew with every passing day, and I fed off it. Each new message chipped away at her, leaving her more vulnerable, more exposed. She was on the brink, and I could sense it. She started staying up late, pacing the living room after I went to bed, or sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at her phone as if waiting for the next message to arrive. The fear was consuming her, just as I had planned. And yet, I wasn't done. This was only the beginning. With each passing day, Kelly's anxiety intensified. morphing into a palpable tension that enveloped our home. The light in her eyes, which once danced with joy, had dulled, replaced by a constant flicker of fear. I watched her closely, relishing the way her demeanor changed as the weight of her secret pressed down on her. She was becoming a shell of the woman I once knew, her laughter replaced by nervous chuckles, her confident stride transformed into a furtive shuffle. It was a thrilling spectacle, watching the very person who had betrayed me unravel before my eyes. Sleep became an elusive refuge for her. I noticed her tossing and turning at night, her body rigid with anxiety. There were nights when I'd wake to the sound of her whispering into her phone, furtively texting someone, and I'd feign sleep, pretending to be oblivious to the reality of her betrayal. Every time she glanced at the screen, her expression was one of horror, as if she expected the truth to spill out at any moment. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her mind as she wrestled with her fears, consumed by the possibility of exposure. In our conversations, she was on edge. Casual topics felt loaded with hidden meanings. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, processing every word I said, trying to decipher whether I was aware of her infidelity. I watched her play the role of the devoted wife, smiling and laughing, but I could see the cracks forming beneath the surface. She would often pause mid-sentence, her eyes flickering toward the door or her phone, as if expecting someone, or something, to come crashing in and reveal her dark secret. I continued to feed her paranoia with carefully crafted messages, letting the panic rise like a tidal wave, slowly but surely pulling her under. "Don't worry, Kelly. Your secret is safe for now," I would write, my fingers dancing across the keyboard with delight. Each message was like a drop of poison, steadily corroding her peace of mind. But how long can you keep it hidden? I made sure to time these messages perfectly, sending them at times when she would be particularly vulnerable. If I knew she had an important meeting at work, I'd send a message right before she left, taunting her, "Hope everyone's ready for the truth." It always comes out in the end. Watching her pace the house, her hands shaking as she read those words, felt like a power trip I hadn't anticipated. I reveled in her uncertainty, savoring the knowledge that I held the strings to her sanity. Despite her best efforts to maintain a facade, I could tell she was nearing her breaking point. Her reactions were becoming more exaggerated, the slightest sound would startle her, and she often caught herself staring blankly into space, lost in thought. On several occasions, I caught her staring at the mirror, almost as if she was searching for a way to disappear, to escape the reality she had created. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted to take this to the next level, to elevate her panic into sheer terror. That's when I started to formulate my next move, the ultimate act of psychological warfare. I would hint that her secret would be revealed during a significant event, one that would bring all of her colleagues and superiors together in one room. Kelly had been promoted at work, a significant achievement that she had been eagerly anticipating for months. To celebrate, we had planned a dinner party, inviting her colleagues and some of her higher-ups. It was supposed to be a night of recognition and joy, a chance for her to showcase her success and enjoy the fruits of her labor. But instead, I would turn it into the very stage of her downfall. With a flick of my wrist, I typed out the next message, the one that would shake her to her core. "Don't forget about the dinner next week, Kelly. I hope you're ready for the truth to come out in front of all your colleagues. It's going to be a night to remember." As I sent the message, a rush of exhilaration coursed through me. I could already picture her reaction, the way her breath would hitch in her throat, how she would freeze, eyes wide, the color draining from her face. I imagined her frantically trying to formulate a plan to avoid disaster, her mind racing to find a way to control the narrative before it spiraled out of her grasp. Over the next few days, Kelly's behavior became increasingly erratic. I watched as she went through a range of emotions, from anxious determination to sheer panic. She threw herself into preparations for the dinner, trying to keep herself busy, but it only seemed to heighten her anxiety. She checked the guest list obsessively, making sure everything was perfect, all while the looming threat of exposure hovered in the background like a dark cloud. Each time she glanced at her phone, I could see the fear etched on her features. I'd sit silently across from her at dinner, the facade of normalcy playing out in front of me. "Everything okay?" I'd ask innocently, feigning ignorance. She'd smile tightly, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers fidgeted with her napkin. The closer we got to the dinner, the more I could sense her growing desperation. I'd watch her pace the house late at night, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as if it were a lifeline. I could tell she was weighing her options, trying to think of ways to avert disaster. But no amount of planning would save her from the inevitable. With every passing moment, I knew that I was drawing closer to the climax of my plan. I had turned her triumph into a potential catastrophe, and I could hardly contain my excitement at the thought of watching it all unfold. The dinner would be the perfect stage for her downfall, a public exposure of her deceit in front of everyone she had tried so hard to impress. I could hardly wait for the day to arrive when she would finally confront her fears, and I would be there to witness it all. As the date of the dinner drew closer, I could see the strain of anticipation and dread taking a visible toll on Kelly. She had always been the type of person who thrived under pressure, yet now she was a shadow of her former self, a woman cornered by her own choices. It was almost poetic, watching her frantically try to navigate through this mess she had created. Deep down, I knew that the reality of the situation had finally begun to sink in, and that sense of impending doom hung over her like a dark cloud. In the days leading up to the event, I watched her carefully weigh her options. I could see the flicker of panic in her eyes each time she picked up her phone or received a message. There was no doubt she was consumed by fear, her mind racing with the possibilities of what might happen. I watched as she spiraled further into anxiety, and I savored every moment. It was like watching a tightly wound clock inch closer to midnight, knowing that once the hands met, everything would explode. Kelly attempted to cancel the dinner, throwing around phrases like family emergency and work obligations. But deep down, she knew she couldn't back out. Doing so would not only expose her feeble excuses but would also put her reputation at stake. This was a crucial moment in her career. Her promotion hinged on this event, and she was determined to maintain the illusion of success. Watching her grapple with this internal conflict only fueled my anticipation. Maybe we should postpone it, she suggested one evening as we sat on the couch, her voice trembling slightly. I could sense the urgency in her words, and the way her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape route. I looked at her, feigning innocence, and replied, "Why would you want to do that? Everyone is looking forward to it. It'll be a great celebration." My tone was casual, but inside, I was practically giddy. I knew she was trapped, and there was nothing she could do to avoid the inevitable. I could see the flicker of desperation cross her face as she realized the weight of her situation. She wasn't just dealing with her anxiety anymore, she was also responsible for the expectations of her colleagues and her boss. The thought of disappointing them, of having them question her commitment and professionalism, sent her further into a spiral of panic. I watched as her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms, a clear sign of her building frustration and fear. In the days that followed, Kelly became increasingly restless. She spent hours in front of the mirror, applying makeup meticulously and checking and rechecking her outfit. But the confidence that used to radiate from her was gone, replaced by an almost frenetic energy. Each time she glanced at her reflection, I could see the internal battle waging within her. She wanted to look perfect for her colleagues, to present a facade of normalcy, but the weight of her secret loomed over her like a guillotine ready to drop. I relished the thought of her discomfort, the way she fidgeted during dinner prep, trying to get everything just right. She practiced her speeches, rehearsing her words as if they could somehow drown out the truth that was waiting to surface. I could feel her frustration boiling over as the tension continued to build. Every time I walked into the room, her eyes would narrow, and I could sense the growing unease between us. I was playing a role, and she had no idea. On the day of the dinner, the air was thick with anticipation. I watched Kelly as she flitted around the house, her anxiety palpable. She was on the brink, every detail of the evening seeming to magnify her already heightened nerves. The guest list was checked and rechecked, the table was set with precision, and the food was prepared to perfection. Yet, despite the elaborate arrangements, she was a mess inside, frantically pacing the kitchen as the clock ticked down. Now and then, she would stop and pull out her phone, scanning for messages, glancing at the screen with wide eyes. I knew my previous threats lingered in her mind, haunting her like a ghost. The thought of me revealing her secret was an omnipresent specter. It was almost too easy to watch her drown in her panic. With every passing moment, I could sense her resolve crumbling beneath the weight of her guilt. Finally, as evening approached and the guests began to arrive, Kelly stood in front of the mirror for one last check. She adjusted her hair, reapplying lipstick, trying desperately to maintain the facade of the confident woman she once was. I stepped into the hallway, where I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation as her colleagues arrived. They were oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. As I walked back into the living room, I caught her eye. There was a flicker of fear, a momentary glimpse of vulnerability that sent a thrill through me. The time had come. She was about to face the music, and I could hardly contain my excitement. I leaned closer, allowing a smirk to cross my lips as I whispered, "You ready for tonight?" Her response was a weak smile, but the tremor in her voice told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't ready, not at all. And as the minutes ticked down to the moment when everything would change, I could feel the tension in the air crackling like electricity. Soon, the truth would be laid bare, and I would be there to witness it all. Tonight was not just another dinner party. It was the culmination of my plan, the perfect stage for her humiliation. The moment she had been dreading was upon us, and I was ready to enjoy every second of it. I stepped back and took a deep breath, savoring the anticipation, knowing that soon, Kelly's carefully constructed world would come crashing down around her. The evening of the dinner arrived with an air of excitement and tension swirling around us like a storm ready to unleash its fury. Kelly had arranged everything meticulously. The restaurant was beautifully decorated, the tables adorned with elegant centerpieces, and the ambient lighting set just right to create an inviting atmosphere. I could sense the anticipation of her colleagues, friends, and even her boss, who were all eager to celebrate her recent promotion. Little did they know, beneath the surface of this celebratory facade, chaos was brewing. As we entered the restaurant, Kelly's face lit up with a smile, but I could see the cracks forming beneath her polished exterior. Her eyes darted nervously from table to table, scanning the room as if searching for an escape route. I could sense her anxiety simmering just beneath the surface, and every time she glanced at her phone, it was a reminder of the tension that loomed over us. She was constantly on edge as if the very walls of the restaurant were closing in on her, threatening to expose her secret at any moment. Seated at the table, surrounded by her colleagues and friends, Kelly tried to engage in conversation. But I noticed her laughter was strained. Each time her phone buzzed, she would jump slightly, her breath hitching as she quickly glanced down to check the screen. I watched her struggle to maintain her composure, to project an image of confidence and happiness, but the tension in her shoulders told a different story. The excitement of the night was palpable, yet she was trapped in a whirlwind of dread and guilt. Her colleagues toasted her success, raising glasses filled with sparkling wine, their cheers ringing out like a celebratory anthem. Kelly smiled and raised her glass, but her eyes betrayed her, they flickered with fear as she looked around the table, her mind undoubtedly racing with thoughts of impending revelation. She was fighting to keep her cool, and I admired her effort even as I knew the storm was brewing just beneath the surface. As dinner progressed, I played my part effortlessly, maintaining an air of calm and normalcy. I engaged in light-hearted conversations, laughed at jokes, and shared anecdotes that elicited genuine laughter from those around us. I wanted her to feel safe, to think that everything was fine, while inside, I was savoring the delicious irony of her plight. My demeanor was relaxed, a stark contrast to the tension radiating from her. I caught glimpses of her glancing at her phone, fingers trembling slightly as she typed out a message, her brow furrowing with each passing moment. It was a dance I had orchestrated, and she was unwittingly playing her part. Caught in the web of her deception, I reveled in the knowledge that she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I was more than happy to let the suspense build. As the night wore on, I noticed Kelly becoming more restless. She kept fidgeting in her seat, adjusting her napkin, playing with the silverware, and casting anxious glances around the restaurant. I could almost hear her heart racing, the rhythm of her anxiety matching the lively conversation around us. Her colleagues chatted enthusiastically about projects and plans, completely unaware of the turmoil brewing within Kelly. Finally, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. The restaurant staff brought out a beautifully decorated cake and a surprise dessert to honor Kelly's promotion. As they set it down in front of her, everyone erupted in applause, urging her to say a few words. This was her moment to shine, yet I could see the panic wash over her face. Her hands trembled as she reached for the microphone, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Thank you, everyone," she began, her voice shaky but striving to maintain an air of poise. I'm so grateful for this opportunity and for all of your support. It means a lot to me. She forced a smile, but I could see the fear lurking behind her eyes, the dread of the secret that hung over her like a guillotine. As she spoke, I couldn't help but notice the way her colleagues leaned in, captivated by her words, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around her. Kelly was desperately trying to project confidence. Yet each sentence felt like a battle, as if she were fighting against the tide of her guilt. Then, just as I had hoped, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, a message from my anonymous account, perfectly timed. I subtly glanced down at my phone, my heart racing with excitement as I read the words, "It's time. Everyone deserves to know the truth." I could see Kelly's reaction immediately. The color drained from her face as her eyes widened in horror, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around the table, searching for the source of the message, her mind racing as panic gripped her. The laughter and chatter of her colleagues faded into muffled background noise as her world began to spiral out of control. Her hand shook as she clutched the microphone tighter, her mind battling against the very real threat that now loomed over her. She took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure, but I could see her world crumbling. This was the moment I had orchestrated, the culmination of her fear. The exposure she dreaded. Kelly glanced at me, her eyes pleading for support, but I merely smiled, feigning innocence as if I had no idea what was happening. I was savoring the delicious irony of it all, the way she was trapped in a web of her own making. Her colleagues began to notice her unease, their expressions shifting from joy to concern as they leaned in, questioning her with curious glances. "Are you okay, Kelly?" one of her coworkers asked, genuine concern etched across their face. "Yeah, I'm fine," she stammered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. It was as if the walls were closing in on her, and she was desperately trying to find a way out. The tension in the room escalated, and I could feel the atmosphere shift. The laughter that had filled the air moments before began to fade, replaced by a heavy silence. Everyone could sense that something was wrong, and Kelly's discomfort was palpable. I watched, enthralled, as she struggled to hold it together, fighting against the inevitable reveal that loomed just around the corner. As the cake was cut and served, I made sure to lean in close to Kelly, whispering, "You know they'll find out, don't you? Just a matter of time." I could see her body stiffen, the realization sinking in as her worst fears came to fruition. Her face contorted with anxiety, and I could feel the tension radiating from her like a heatwave. This was it. The moment of reckoning was near, and I could hardly contain my excitement. The night, which had been meant to celebrate her success, was now spiraling into a chaotic storm of fear and dread, and I was there to witness it all unfold. With each passing moment, Kelly's facade began to crack, and I reveled in the sweet anticipation of what was to come. The night was just beginning, and I knew that the truth would soon emerge, shaking the very foundation of her carefully constructed world. As the dinner progressed, I could feel the tension in the room reaching a boiling point. Kelly's anxious glances had escalated to frantic, almost desperate looks. The weight of her secret loomed larger than ever, and I knew she was teetering on the brink. Her colleagues were laughing, toasting her success, and sharing stories of her achievements, but each word seemed to push her further into a corner, forcing her to confront the truth she had so desperately tried to hide. Suddenly, in the middle of a conversation about an upcoming project, Kelly's facade shattered. I noticed her take a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the table. I could see her heart racing, and it felt as if time had slowed. The laughter around us faded, replaced by a heavy silence as she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. All eyes turned to her, curiosity mingling with concern. "I can't do this anymore," she exclaimed, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. The room fell into a stunned silence, every pair of eyes fixated on her. Her colleagues exchanged bewildered glances. Unsure of what was happening, their cheerful atmosphere instantly replaced by a palpable sense of dread. Kelly took a moment to collect herself, her chest heaving as she fought to compose her thoughts. "I have something to say," she continued, her voice quavering but growing stronger with each word. "I can't hide it. I've been unfaithful. I've been cheating on my husband with Michael." Gasps erupted around the table, shock rippling through the gathered crowd. The reality of her confession hung in the air like a heavy fog. Suffocating and dark, the eyes that had once regarded her with admiration now reflected disbelief and pity. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, and yet I was utterly exhilarated. Every secret she had fought to keep hidden was now laid bare for all to see. Kelly's face flushed crimson as the reality of her confession sank in. She looked around the table, meeting the shocked expressions of her colleagues, her boss, and her friends. Each face wore a mask of disbelief, and murmurs of surprise echoed around the restaurant. This was not how she had envisioned her night. Her celebration had turned into an unintentional spectacle, a theater of humiliation. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face as she covered her mouth in horror at what she had just admitted. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I couldn't keep lying." Her voice trembled as she spoke, the weight of her guilt spilling out in waves. "I thought I could manage it, but I've ruined everything." The room was silent except for the sound of her sobs, the air thick with the tension of her revelation. I watched as the shock settled into a mixture of sympathy and judgment from her colleagues. They glanced at each other, their expressions shifting from concern to a quiet realization that the woman they admired was not who they thought she was. In that moment, Kelly's career, the promotion she had worked so hard for, the reputation she had built, was crumbling to dust before her eyes. She had been elevated to a position of respect, and now, in a single confession, she had dismantled everything. Her career was effectively over, and I could see the realization washing over her, an avalanche of despair that was almost palpable. It was a spectacle to behold. I had orchestrated this moment, each detail leading to this climax, and now the world she had built was collapsing like a house of cards. I could almost feel the satisfaction swelling within me as I watched her despair unfold. The sweet taste of revenge lingered on my tongue. Kelly stood there, exposed and vulnerable, her tears reflecting the stark reality of her situation. The silence was deafening, and I felt the weight of every gaze upon her. Some of her colleagues looked on with sympathy, others with disappointment, and a few with a sense of schadenfreude, reveling in her misfortune. I savored the moment, knowing that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Finally, Kelly's boss, visibly shaken, cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Kelly, we need to discuss this," he began, his voice low and serious. But Kelly, clearly overwhelmed, could barely manage to respond. The shock of her confession had left her reeling, and I could see the reality of her impending downfall settling in. I sat back, letting the chaos unfold around me. Kelly had unwittingly placed herself on display, exposing her deepest fears and regrets to everyone she had once hoped to impress. The irony was delicious, a fitting conclusion to the elaborate plan I had executed. As the murmurs grew louder, I knew that the evening had spiraled out of her control. Kelly had unleashed a torrent of emotions that would echo long after this night was over. In that instant, I felt a surge of power, watching as she faced the consequences of her actions, a life shattered by betrayal. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the din of voices became a blur in my mind. I took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over me like a heavy cloak. I realized that it was time for me to step away from this unfolding drama, to exit the stage while the spotlight was still on her. In a calm, deliberate motion, I stood up from my seat, the wood of the chair creaking softly as I pushed it back. The room seemed to hush momentarily, all eyes flicking to me, startled by my sudden movement. I felt their gazes shift from Kelly, the central figure of the evening's chaos, to me, a mere spectator who had become the architect of this downfall. With a measured breath, I glanced around the table, taking in the faces that had once been filled with admiration for Kelly. Now they were a mix of concern, confusion, and something darker, curiosity tinged with excitement. I could feel their eyes boring into me, silently questioning why I was leaving. But I didn't owe them an explanation. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice steady, laced with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the turmoil surrounding Kelly. "It's been quite an evening." My tone was deliberately casual, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Without another word, I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing softly against the restaurant's polished floor. I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me as I moved further from the scene, a quiet satisfaction enveloping me like a warm embrace. I had executed my plan flawlessly, and now, as I made my exit, I left Kelly to face the consequences of her actions alone. With each step, I could feel the weight of the past few weeks lifting off my shoulders. The darkness of betrayal had been heavy, but now it felt as though I was shedding layers of pain and disappointment. I had orchestrated this moment, ensuring that Kelly faced the repercussions of her choices. The door swung open, a breath of fresh air greeting me as I stepped outside into the cool night. The chaos behind me faded into the distance, the sounds of shock and disbelief muffled by the closing door. I took a moment to inhale deeply, the crisp air filling my lungs, invigorating me with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in a long time. I walked away from the restaurant, my heart light and unburdened. Kelly's world had just unraveled, and I had been the catalyst for her downfall. I could hear faint echoes of her sobs and her colleagues' murmurs behind me, but I didn't turn back. There was nothing more for me to see. Tonight had been a decisive turning point, a moment that would mark the end of our shared life together. I had released the weight of betrayal, allowing it to consume her while I stepped away unscathed. The plan had been executed flawlessly, and now, I was free to begin anew, leaving the ruins of Kelly's life behind me. As I walked into the night, I felt a sense of closure. I had not only taken back my power but had also freed myself from the chains of betrayal that had bound me for so long. I knew the road ahead would be different, perhaps even challenging, but I was ready to embrace the unknown. After all, sometimes letting go was the most liberating choice of all.